When the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine declared independence in 1991. It found itself with Europe's second largest army, including 1,000 tactical nuclear weapons. Ukraine had the physical warheads, but Russia had the launch code. The country debated if they should retain some of the newer warheads or return them all to Russia for destruction. However, some systems had already reached the end of their service life, including 2 regiments of SS-19 missiles that had to be sent to storage. Ukraine realized that it would be very difficult and expensive to maintain a credible nuclear force, so they decided to transfer all warheads to Russia for destruction. They accomplished this by 1992-93. In 1993, they adopted non-alignment, and the same year saw their first doctrine: reduction and elimination of nuclear force, and granted security by the world community. The world community guarantees were formalized in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which was called Memorandum on Security Assurance in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It was signed on the 5th of December 1994 by Belarus, Kazakhstan and Ukraine. The guarantors were Russia, the USA and the UK. This memorandum stated, among other things, the borders of the new states would be respected. Signatories would refrain from threatening or the use of force. Refrain from using economical pressure or influencing their politics. In case the new state would be the victim of aggression or threatened with nuclear force, they would directly apply to the UN Security Council. They would refrain from the use of nuclear arms in all 3 countries. They would consult with each other if questions would arise. In general, this memorandum gave security assurances from Russia, the UK and the USA to Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan. The Ukrainian army in 1991 had inherited 3 Soviet military districts. It totaled around 780,000 military personnel, 6,500 tanks, 1,100 combat aircrafts, and around 500 ships. The new Ukrainian armed forces were de facto a Soviet army under a new name, and that would have to be reformed if they wanted to really create a new state. Problems were there already from the start. The conventional forces had to be reduced, as there was a problem paying serving personnel. The living conditions were poor, and about 100,000 soldiers were waiting to be transferred to Ukraine from other old Soviet republics. Other soldiers in Ukraine were waiting to be transferred away from Ukraine to their respective countries. Several new armed institutions were present or were created. Among them were the border troops, interior troops, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so on. Many reforms were planned during this period, but they seldom reached anywhere near their stated goals. Several ended up being simple statements on pieces of paper. The Ukrainian President Kuchma instigated 2 state programs in 1994. The first one was the State Program for the Building Up and Development of the Armed Forces. And the second was the State Program for the Development of Armaments and Military Equipment. The newly established Directorate for the Build-up and Development of the Armed Forces was now headed by Major General Dmitry Umanets. Little came of this program, and after 1 year nothing had really been done. A new program was initiated, the State Program for the Build-up and Development of the Armed Forces of Ukraine for 1995 to 2010. The goal of this program was to renew the armed forces, aiming for a smaller, well-armed and defensive force within the state budget. It was a program with what they wanted to do more than what they could do. It contained few concrete ways to achieve the stated goals. However, by 1996 they had created a staff, and that staff had drafted far-reaching reforms for the armed forces. What those reforms were is not easy to know. They were kept so secret, not even the Chief of Staff was told. Or so Major General Leonid Kravchuk reported. Several mistakes or bad choices were made along the way. An example would be the military institutes. In 1992, all military institutes were transferred from the military services to the MOD. In 1994, all military institutions were transferred back to the military services from the MOD. In 1996, all military institutions were again subordinated to the MOD from the military services. In 1997, the military institutions were again transferred to the military services from the MOD. This was obviously a waste of resources and time, both of which the new state lacked. The defense program, the State Program of Armed Forces Construction and Development by 2005 was initiated in 1997, which stated what they wanted to do, not in fact what they probably could do. They anticipated an armed force of some 450,000 personnel. The personnel did shrink from the 780,000 inherited from the Soviet Union in 1991 down to 428,000 personnel by 1999. The defense budget very uncertain for the period 91-92. In 93 it was $300 million. By 1999 it had reached $1.2 billion. It was a small budget for the size of its armed forces, and the lack of money would hamper all areas, but maybe most of all procurements. A way to raise money was arms export, and Ukraine managed some successful exports and had some failures. The failures could be seen in the strategic bomber fleet Ukraine inherited when they gained independence. In 1994, Ukraine wanted to sell the aging bomber fleet to Russia, Tu-160s and Tu-95, and they wanted to sell them for around $8 billion. By 1995, after going back and forward, Russia decided it was not interested in the planes. By this time, only 15% of the planes were airworthy. In 1999, the US sponsored the destruction of some of the bombers, and others had been sent to Russia to cover a gas debt, around 11 Tu-160s and 27 Tu-95s. This year it was decided that the remaining bombers should be scrapped, but this was not the case. In 2001, 3 Tu-95s and 8 Tu-160 were sent to Russia to again clear a gas debt of $285 million. A success for Ukraine was the selling of some 320 T-80UD tanks to Pakistan for $650 million. This deal in itself saved the Kharkiv-Malyshev tank factory from bankruptcy. Any actual modernization of the Ukrainian equipment during this period is difficult to find any evidence of. In basic, it was an armed force that had shrunk, but in general, it was still a Soviet Union-styled army. It had the same equipment and tactics as before independence. The budget was small, funds were misappropriated or used ineffectively, and reforms lacked clear direction or implementation. Combat readiness declined during this period. Another big problem for Ukraine at this point was corruption. In 1999, Ukraine was placed 75, with a score of 2.6 out of 10. Ukraine had 4 defense ministers, all military personnel. The longest serving was Colonel General Morozov between 91 and 93, and General Kuzmuk holding the post between 1996 to 2001. This period would see a further reduction of the armed forces, with some reforms initiated. The budget would double, but would still be low, being only half of the Swedish defense budget at the time. In 2000, the State Program of Armed Forces of Ukraine, Reform and Development until 2005 was adopted. It was a continuation of the program initiated in 1997. The aim was to reduce the armed forces down to 375,000 serving personnel. This size was still unsustainable, as even 300,000 soldiers would require around $5 to $6 billion, and the budget in 2000 was only $1 billion. This led to constant underfunding of the armed forces, and there was little money for modernization. Inertia would also slow down reforms, especially in the early parts of the decade. Until 2005, the reforms managed to reduce the army down to 273,000 serving personnel. Still too large for the economy, but going down to a sustainable level. The next program adopted was the State Program of Armed Forces of Ukraine, Development 2006 to 2011, which was approved in 2005. This was the first reform program that actually aimed to increase combat effectiveness of the armed forces within the means of the budget. The goals were to continue reducing the armed forces down to 143,000 serving personnel. They also aimed to move towards NATO standards regarding command and control. In this period, they also reduced the military services from 4 down to 3, combining air and air defense into one service. They also wanted to establish joint commands for the different services. Western approaches to education, combat training, and management was also a goal. It was reasonable goals, but with limited funds, they had to prioritize. The armed forces were divided into Joint Rapid Response Forces, JRRF, Main Defense Forces, MDF, and other forces. However, like previous programs, this was not implemented to any satisfactory degree, as the resources were simply not there. The only year they got close was 2008, but the financial crisis would see the 2009 budget reaching only a fifth of the planned funds. That improved in 2010 when they got 70% of the planned means. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, would take part in NATO-led operations, with some 40,000 soldiers taking part over the years. They would get experience, but also use limited means that could have gone to the reform programs. In 2001, the stated goal was an armed force of 240,000 soldiers, which would all be professional by 2015. In 2002, they anticipated an armed force of 180,000 serving personnel, with the bulk, if not all, being volunteers or contract soldiers. This was also to be achieved by 2015. In 2007, Yulia Tymoshenko suggested that an all-volunteer force should be implemented already by 2008. Others stated that 2010 was an achievable goal. The financial crisis of 2008 and the Russian invasion of Georgia would delay these plans. By 2010, the armed forces had some 214,000 serving personnel, with conscripts still making up part of that force. Conscription in Ukraine was unpopular and draft dodging happened. Paying for exemptions on medical ground or otherwise was not unheard of. In this period, they had 6 different defense ministers, most serving 1 year. Anatoly Hyrysenko, serving almost 3 years, were the exception. He served between 2005 until 2007. Little modernization seems to have occurred. Neither tanks nor aircraft were modernized. Lacking spare parts and funding, some sources stated that up to 60 combat aircraft were sold between 2007 and 2017. The arms export would continue to rise during this period. In 2000, they exported for around $600 million. That would reach $1.2 billion by 2008. Ukraine had a large surplus of military hardware that was sold. T-72 tanks were sold to Kenya and Georgia for around $50,000 apiece. The corruption perception index for the country during this period is not an uplifting reading. In 2000, they had a score of only 1.5 out of 10, placing it on the 87th place in the world. By 2010, the score had improved to 2.4, placing the country just below Uganda in this corruption index. It was still ahead of Russia, who only scored 2.1 that year. This period would see the Ukrainian armed forces reaching their lowest point in manpower and most likely in combat readiness. It would by the end face civil war and a de facto war with Russia. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych was elected Ukrainian president, and he would stop many of the ongoing reforms. He rolled back Western-style reforms, disbanded the joint commands, and stopped management reforms. The only real reform he kept in place was the move towards an all-out volunteer force with the aim of having 100,000 soldiers by 2017. His reasons for these reforms was that Ukraine did not face any imminent military threat. These actions would lead to a Ukrainian armed force more suited to handle local border conflicts rather than large-scale military conflicts. The army was still underfunded and now undertrained. The much-needed reforms to combat ineffectiveness and increase combat readiness were stopped. In 2013, Yanukovych abolished general conscription for the armed forces, even though it would still be in place for interior troops of the Minister of Internal Affairs. By 2014, the Ukrainian armed forces had nominally 80,000 troops that were in no sense combat ready. They had around 770 tanks and fewer than 1,000 artillery pieces. As coming events would show, it would seem that Yanukovych prepared the country for a Russian incursion. How much his actions would play a role is difficult to say. They had struggled even before he came into power. But for sure his actions did not help. The defense budget would continue to increase, but a lot less than was needed. In 2010, they had $2.2 billion. In 2014, it was at $3.2 billion. Corruption was still a big problem, and that would hinder the effective use of resources. In 2011, the corruption perception index for the country was 2.3. With a small dip in 2013, it would slightly improve to 2.6 by 2014. In 2014, the army had stopped all effective reforms, and the actual combat-ready troops were around 6,000. Some units had only 20% of the manpower, but 60% of the equipment. The military hardware were also aging. Only 1% of the hardware had been manufactured within the last 10 years. When Viktor Yanukovych started moving closer to Russia, the Euromaidan demonstrations erupted, which would see Yanukovych flee to Russia. And Russia would launch a hybrid war against Ukraine. And Ukraine would struggle against this external and internal threat at the same time. This period would see Crimea being annexed by Russia, civil unrest in the Donbas region, fueled by Russia, and finally Russian and Ukrainian forces meeting on the battlefield. In 2014, the Ukrainian army was in no condition to resist the Russian takeover of Crimea, and it struggled to contain the fighting in the Donbas region. They had a total of around 130,000 serving personnel in all services at the outbreak of the conflict, but few units were combat ready. Corruption was still a problem, salaries were not being paid, and they had many other problems. 70% of the Ukrainian armed forces in Crimea would simply switch sides and go from Ukraine to Russia. Their admiral of the Ukrainian Navy, Berezovsky, he switched sides and went to Russia after only 2 days into the conflict. In the end, the Ukrainian Navy was left with one frigate. Several planes and helicopters were also captured by Russia, and this was only the start of the conflict. The Ukrainian armed forces had around 6,000 combat-ready troops, according to the defense minister. The rest of the units had 60% equipment, but only 20% personnel. 92% of the weapons available were old and not well maintained. Only around 1% of the hardware was new, and in this case new means manufactured within 10 years. The nominal force in 2014 was 64,000 in the army, and the navy had around 7,000 serving personnel. Ukraine would instigate several partial mobilizations. 3 of them would occur in 2014, with a total of 110,000 reservists being called up. The following 3 waves of partial mobilization in 2015 were not as successful as the first ones. This differed depending on the districts. For example, the Kiev districts between 80 to 100%. In other districts, they only reached 25 to 60% of the stated goals for waves 5 and 6. In May 2015, conscription was reinstated with 18 months of service. Volunteer units were created in the form of territorial battalions and battalions under the police and National Guard. Up to 37 battalions were fighting in the Donbas area by September 2014. Some of these were private, self-financed, but would later be incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces, or disbanded. Some battalions were special groups, like right-wing battalions under the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps. Others specialized in drone warfare. The military district command structure was lacking in 2014 for the Donbas region. Only the North and South commands were in place. By 2015, a new division was created with 4 commands: North in Chernihiv, East at Dnipro City, West in Rivne, and South in Odessa. New units were also formed during this time, giving Ukraine 46 brigade formations by 2017. The army started increasing its exercise on brigade and battalion levels. For example, in 2014 there were no brigade exercise and only 17 battalion exercises. By 2016, that had risen to 17 brigade exercises and 93 battalion exercises. The budget would increase during this period from 3.2 billion in 2014, reaching 5.9 billion by 2020. Still a modest increase for a country that was de facto at war, but an improvement nonetheless. Between 2014 and 2020, the defense budget in GDP went from 2.2% to 4.4%. We can compare this to the Swedish defense budget at the time, which was 6.4 billion in 2020. The budget was spent as follows, and this is in Ukrainian hryvnias. The need for additional hardware, but lacking funds for major external or internal procurement, meant that Ukraine focused on getting armaments in storage, modernized and maintained. Around 800 armored vehicles were lost between 2014 and 2016. About 50% were abandoned from breakdowns or had been hit but not really disabled, or it could have been salvageable. Ukraine had sold tanks, planes and artillery systems, and they had also cannibalized some hardware to keep other hardware in service. However, the least expensive way to increase the military hardware situation was to repair and modernize whatever was in stock or in storage. So funding was added for this, and a large-scale effort was initiated to bring back tanks, planes, artillery systems, and so on. It should also be noted that many pieces of hardware would be repaired, sent to the front, then refurbished again and sent to the front again. And artillery system, for example, the barrel has a certain number of times it can be fired. After 2016, this effort decreased, possibly because the conflict went into a low-intensity phase, but also probable because the stock that could be made into working order was being depleted, and Soviet-era spare parts were running out. Procurement of new equipment would be done, but far from enough to cover the armed forces' needs. By 2015, the frontline units were equipped with better working hardware. It had a better organization, and even if the mobilization and conscription were not always popular, it was working. By 2017, the Ukrainian armed forces had gone from a force of 130,000 serving personnel, most of which were not combat ready, to between 250 to 300,000 mostly combat ready soldiers. with an active reserve, and many of those in the reserve had combat experience. Tank, planes, and artillery systems were still old, but in better working condition. Western support, inadequate as it was, started to trickle in, and it made an impact. Support programs and military aid packages before 2022. In 2015, the RAND Corporation was invited to review the Ukrainian armed forces, and they came up with several areas for improvement, many of which had been in the program of reforms and development of the armed forces for 2006 to 2011, a program which had never been implemented. US had been sending military aid amounting to around $105 million per year before the Russian annexation of Crimea. Since 2014, some $2.5 billion in aid have been sent to Ukraine, this until 2021. Most of this money was spent on training, mentoring Ukrainian armed forces, and providing some, usually non-lethal, military equipment. That included drones, Humvees, night vision, and military ambulances. In other words, non-lethal military equipment was provided. By 2020, another package of $250 million was approved. This included 150 Javelin anti-tank missiles. In 2021, a further $125 million were approved. This including 2 patrol boats, counter-artillery radars, and combat evacuation training. Later, $150 million were added, and then $60 million on top of that for both lethal and non-lethal equipment. This also including Javelin missiles. The UK aid would start in October 2014 with a package of non-lethal equipment and training. This would include combat training, intelligence gathering, and medical plus logistical skills. In 2015, Operation Orbital was launched. This included training in medical, infantry, and survival skills. It also included handling IEDs, fighting in urban areas, planning, engineering, and counterattacks. A priority of this package was to train the trainers, so the Ukrainian armed forces themselves could pass the knowledge on. In 2020, a naval package was agreed upon to improve Ukraine's naval capabilities. NATO. In 2016, even though NATO had other programs running before, the Comprehensive Assistance Package was signed. It focused on command, control, communication, and computers. It also focused on logistics, cyber defense, medical, handling IEDs, and clearing unexploded military ordnance. The EU also had programs running, mostly focused on the economical side, whereas the military side were more handled by NATO. Just before the 2022 Russian invasion, the UK would provide 2,000 anti-armor missiles. That package would also include rations, helmets, sleeping mats, and body armor. The support after the 2022 invasion. The US have so far sent at least 800 Stinger missiles, over 2,000 Javelins, 6,000 AT-4 anti-armor systems, assorted small arms, helmets. They have also provided over 100 howitzers, and more advanced weaponry have been approved. EU have seen different member states provide weapons. At the start of the conflict, mostly defensive weapons like the Javelin missiles. It's interesting to see that Sweden have provided 10,000 AT-4 missiles. And that was the first provision of lethal weapons from Sweden to any country since World War II, when we provided similar assistance to Finland. Germany have been a little bit more reluctant to provide armaments, but they are now shipping or have shipped some howitzers, mobile howitzers. In general, the Eastern European countries have been more willing to supply weapons to Ukraine, and the Western EU members have been more willing to supply defensive weapons, but not offensive weapons. Only in May-June 2022 have artillery systems started coming into Ukraine, in smaller batches than needed. Ukraine requested MiG-29 planes from EU member states, but political considerations stopped the transfer of such offensive weapons. This is still the case in June 2022. The biggest improvement has been done by the Ukrainian armed forces themselves, since the fighting in the Donbas region started. They have moved towards a flexible and low-level command decision structure. Previously, the army had a similar culture to the Russian army. Junior officers needed permission from higher HQ before acting. Ukraine realized that this would take too long, and so more emphasis have been placed on junior officers to make battlefield decisions on the spot, making the Ukrainian forces a much more flexible force, which can especially be seen in the fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces. And this was especially true in the beginning of the war, February-March, when Ukraine outfought the superior Russian forces around Kiev and other cities in the northern part of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces in Crimea by 2014 were around 15,000 men, 41 tanks, 47 artillery systems, and 45 MiG-29. It's estimated that only 4 to 6 of those MiGs were actually airworthy. In addition, there were some 2,500 troops from the Minister of the Interior. In February 2014, the defense minister stated that of all those forces, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 could be expected to fight against Russian forces, if needed. Russia had approximately 12,000 troops in Sevastopol, which would include the 810th Independent Naval Infantry Brigade. 20th of February. Ukrainian troops goes on alert. The 23rd of February. Russia airlifts in a Spetsnaz battalion to Crimea, and airborne units are transferred close to Crimea. 24th. Sevastopol installs a Russian citizen as mayor. The 810th Naval Brigade arrives in the city. 25th of February. The landing ship Nikolai Filchenkov arrives in Sevastopol with 200 Special Forces troops. 27th of February. Russian Special Forces disguised as local citizens takes over the Crimean parliament and raises the Russian flag. Another ship arrives in Sevastopol with 300 additional Russian troops. Russian forces, without insignias of course, will surround the Belbek air base. 28th of February. Several Russian helicopters fly to Crimea in support of their forces. They capture Simferopol airport. Ukrainian air defenses stop further Russian reinforcements via helicopter. The commander of the Ukrainian Navy, Denis Bereskovsky, defects to Russia. Ukrainian units are now more or less boxed in and surrounded in their bases. 3rd of March, Russian captures Tsankoy. On the 6th of March, heavy Russian forces crosses the Kerch Strait. It is probably the 18th Motor Rifle Brigade, the 31st Air Assault Brigade, and the 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade. On the 9th of March, Russian forces capture Chornomorsk. By the 23rd of March, Ukrainian troops still loyal are being evacuated from Crimea. Even though Ukraine had a numerical advantage and more heavy military hardware at the early stages, a lack of coordination, the defection of Denis Berezovsky, and Ukrainian troops switching sides meant that they lost any possibility to effectively resist Russian incursions, and that pretty early on. Loyal troops to Ukraine found themselves simply surrounded in their bases with few options to resist. The Ukrainian brigades had on average 1 out of 3 battalions ready for operations. The Ukrainian equipment between March and April of 2014 was as follows. They had around 230 tanks, not all operational, 430 BMP-1s and BMP-2s, 150 BTR-80s, 131 self-propelled artillery guns, and about 105 MLRS, and 15 helicopters of the type Mi-24. The Ukrainian units. The 25th Airborne Brigade was sent to Donetsk area in March. In April, reserve soldiers reinforced the brigade, and it is sent to Amvrosivka. On the 2nd of June, the 1st Battalion of the brigade is sent to Kherson and Mykolaiv. The 3rd Battalion is formed with mostly mobilized soldiers. The 79th Air Mobile Brigade. It is alerted on the 2nd of March. 1 battalion is ready, and it is sent to Kherson. In late April, the 2nd Battalion is formed of mobilized troops. The 3rd Battalion of the brigade, the 88th Battalion, lacks equipment and personnel, so it is stationed in Odessa. On the 18th of May, the brigade is sent to Zaporozhye, except the 3rd Battalion. In June, the brigade is sent to the Donetsk region. The 95th Air Mobile Brigade. It is alerted in March. 2 battalions are ready for service. The 3rd Battalion gets mobilized troops in March. In March, it is stationed near Crimea, and then it is sent to the Donetsk region. The 80th Air Mobile Brigade. It has 2 battalions, but only 1 is ready for operations. The battalions are stationed in Lviv and Chernivtsi. During March, the 1st Battalion is posted in the Poltava-Sumy region. In April, 1 company of the 1st Battalion secures Luhansk Airport. 24th Mechanized Brigade. A BTG is formed based on the 1st Battalion with mostly contract soldiers. It had a full complement of equipment and it was combat ready. On the 8th of April, it is moved to Chernihiv and then later to the Sumy region. Later, the brigade would move to Poltava and then to the Luhansk area. When combat erupted, it was stationed close to Sloviansk. 2 additional BTGs were formed from the other 2 battalions. The 2nd Battalion BTG was sent to the border region in June. The 3rd BTG was sent to Donbass on the 10th of July. The 1st Tank Brigade. 1 BTG is formed from mobilized personnel. It would also get ready 2 tank battalions, 1 mechanized battalion, and artillery. It was stationed in the Chernihiv-Sumy area. Later it would be deployed to the northern area of Luhansk. Most of its personnel were mobilized. The 30th Mechanized Brigade. The brigade was stationed in the Rivne area by early March. In August, the 1st and the 3rd battalions were sent to Kherson, and the 2nd battalion was sent to Luhansk. 72nd Mechanized Brigade. From March to April, 2 BTGs are formed. The 1st BTG is sent to Zaporozhye on the 20th of March. More units from the brigade arrived in the area by early April. It consisted mostly of mobilized personnel. The 128th Mountain Infantry Brigade. 2 BTGs are formed and sent to the city of Konotop by the 18th of May. Later it is deployed to the Baturin in the Chernihiv sector. By May it has moved to the Luhansk area. 51st Mechanized Brigade. By April, 3 BTGs are formed based on the brigade's battalions. In May, the brigade, consisting mostly of mobilized personnel, is moved to the Donbas region. It is stationed along a line Kurakove, Vuhledar, Volnovakha. 17th Tank Brigade. It was on the verge of being disbanded, so it could not form any BTGs. A fire would break out on the 20th of March, destroying 6 tanks and depleting much of the offensive equipment for the brigade. In April, a few tanks are sent to Isium. 28th Mechanized Brigade. 1 BTG is formed on the 10th of March, but damaged equipment meant it was not operational. By the 7th of July, only 1 BTG is operational and it is sent to the front line. It was an effective unit when the fighting broke out. 93rd Mechanized Brigade. It was sent to Kharkiv in March. Some detachments were sent to the Luhansk area. On the 17th of April, the whole brigade is sent to Luhansk. In May, it formed a line Krasnomarysk, Dobrofilia, Kramatorsk in Donetsk. It was well manned and fully equipped. 92nd Mechanized Brigade. It could not form any cohesive units at the start of the conflict. Some parts were stationed in the Kharkiv area. Only in August could a CTG or Company Tactical Group be sent to the Battle of Ilyovaisk. Events. In early March, pro-Russian demonstrations erupted in eastern Ukraine by unarmed demonstrators, probably emboldened by what had happened in Crimea. 9th of March. Protesters takes over the regional buildings in Luhansk, demanding a referendum regarding an annexation by Russia. Alexander Kharnitov declares himself the people's governor. Pavel Gubarev does the same thing in Donetsk. Other persons will state similar things in other regions. The local Ukrainian law enforcement starts arresting them, but new separatist leadership takes their place. 10th of March. Ukraine regains the possession of the occupied buildings, and some 70 people have been arrested. Protests in Odessa and Kharkiv are ended by the arrest of the separatist leadership. In the Donbas region, the arrests do not stop the brewing conflict. 6th of April. The main administration building in Donetsk is occupied by separatists. 7th of April. The Donetsk People's Republic, or the DNR, is proclaimed. 11 to 12th of April. Similar separatist occupations happen in Luhansk, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Krasny Liman. 15th of April. Ukraine declares an operation to fight terrorists. It's abbreviated ATO. Ukrainian forces retakes the Kramatorsk airfield. 16th of April. Separatists try to take over a military base in Mariupol, throwing Molotov cocktails. They are fired upon by Ukrainian soldiers and they are stopped. 18th of April. Donetsk airport is now under separatist control. 21st of April. Luhansk declares the intent to hold a referendum, either regarding independence or if they should join the Russian Federation. 27th of April. Luhansk separatists declare the Luhansk People's Republic. 2nd of May. Ukrainian forces starts the operations to retake Sloviansk. The 95th Air Mobile Brigade takes up position at Krashun, close to Sloviansk. Between the 2nd and 5th of May, Ukraine will lose 3 helicopters in the area of Sloviansk. Parts of the 24th Mechanized Brigade and the 80th Airborne Brigade are deployed in the area of Luhansk Airport. 13th of May. The 95th Air Mobile Brigade is ambushed near Sloviansk, losing 6 killed, 11 wounded. 22nd of May. The 30th Mechanized Brigade is encircled, close to a bridge between Rubshine and Lysychansk. They break out with the help of other Ukrainian forces. The 51st Mechanized Brigade, near Volnovakha, is attacked, losing 17 killed and 32 wounded. 26th of May. The 93rd Airborne Brigade attacks Donetsk Airport and captures it. 29th of May. One Ukrainian Mi-8 helicopter is shot down near Sloviansk. 12th to 13th of June. The 95th Brigade captures a line Hryhorivka to Dokyshavchevsk. Ukrainian forces pushes out separatists from all of Mariupol. 14th of June. An Il-76 MD is shot down, killing 40 Ukrainian paratroopers and 9 crew. Ukrainian troops at Luhansk Airport are now supplied via airdrops. 1st to 4th of July. Operations are launched towards Sloviansk. One company of the 95th Airborne Brigade captured Artemevsk without losses. 8th of July. Ukrainian troops captures Drushivka. 11th of July. Troops from the 24th Mechanized Brigade comes under Russian artillery fire, with 24 killed and 76 wounded. 13th of July. Ukrainian troops enter Siversk and Vuglehirsk. 17th to 18th of July. Ukrainian troops capture Dzerzhinsk and Sadanivka. Separatists SAM batteries will shoot down Malayan airline flight MH17. The 18th to the 20th of July. Ukrainian troops retakes Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The Great Raid. The 95th Airborne Brigade performed the Great Raid between the 18th of July and the 10th of August. Moving in the line Debaltsev, Shakhtarsk, Petrevsk, Savur-Moly Hill, Stepanivka, Dmitrivka, Myunsisk, Krasny Lush, and Sloviansk. The raid will last 24 days and cover 450 kilometers. This operation will save 2,000 Ukrainian troops and 250 pieces of equipment from encirclement. 24th to 26th of July. Ukrainian troops capture Debaltsev. 27th to 30th of July. The 25th Airborne Brigade performs probing attacks in direction of Debaltsev and Shakhtarsk. August. Around 40,000 Ukrainian military personnel are engaged in the Donbas war. 24th to 25th of August. Russian troops enters the conflict in greater numbers, and they launch a heavy artillery barrage. Approximately 8 Russian BTGs without insignias are now entering Ukrainian territory. 26th of August. Troops from the Russian 98th Airborne Division capture Kostroma. Identified Russian units inside Ukrainian territory are now from the 19th Motorized Infantry Division, from the 7th and 76th Airborne Division, from the 31st and 56th Airborne Assault Brigades, and the 64th Naval Regiment. The Battle of Ilovaisk. On the 7th of August, Ukrainian forces started attacking the town of Ilovaisk. They managed to enter it by the 18th of August and claimed control of the city by the 20th. Ukrainian reinforcements does not arrive in the area. The Donbas battalion in the city finds itself encircled by Russian forces and by separatist forces. This happened between the 24th and the 26th of August, after other Ukrainian forces had been forced to pull back. The Ukrainian 51st Mechanized Brigade attacks the Russian 331st Airborne Regiment close to Koteynikov. It will also attack and capture tanks from the Russian 6th Tank Brigade close to Aronomishne on the 27th of August. A task force from the Ukrainian 92nd Mechanized Brigade is tasked with attacking towards Ilovaisk. Moving via Komsomolsk and then towards the city, they are struck by an artillery barrage when they are in night camp. They will suffer heavy losses in equipment, but few casualties the next day fighting Russian paratroopers. Another Ukrainian battalion, supposed to link up with the task force, is similarly defeated on the 28th of August. On the 29th, an agreement have been reached between the Donbas battalion, encircled, and the separatist forces that it will be allowed to retreat. The battalion forms 2 columns, a northern column with 1,000 men and a southern column with 500 plus soldiers. The northern force comes under attack at Oleksandrivka, splitting the force in 2. The rear part is destroyed. The rest reaches the village of Novokaterinivka, where they dig in. Russian forces will destroy the remaining tanks. Only 42 soldiers will make it back to the Ukrainian lines from this column. The southern column captures the village of Chernovsilske, losing several tanks in the process, but also destroying several tanks from the Russian 6th Tank Brigade and the 31st Air Assault Brigade. However, half the force is now wounded. An agreement is made to let them retreat under a Red Cross flag, but they are forced to hand over all their weapons. During September to December, heavy fighting will occur at Donetsk airport. It is defended by units from the Ukrainian 93rd Mechanized Brigade. In general, the front has stabilized somewhat, even though fighting would continue all along the front. 15th of January. Heavy shelling of Donetsk airport, followed by an attack that dislodges the Ukrainian brigade. 18th to 26th of January. Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the Donetsk airport. The Battle of Debaltseve. Separatist forces had captured the city early on, but by the 28th of July, Ukrainian forces had gained control of it. In January 2015, it was a salient with Ukrainian forces inside and Russian forces pushing from 3 sides with up to 8 Russian BTGs, and perhaps as many separatist formations of a similar size. It was an important strategic position for both sides. 27th of January. DPR forces attacks from Horlivka, but they are repulsed. However, Vulehirsk is captured. The attacks continue, and by the 31st, the Ukrainian troops are close to being cut off, but they are still holding on. 17th of February. Separatist forces are now fighting inside Debaltseve. Both sides have suffered heavy casualties. The Ukrainian position is unattainable, so a retreat is planned for the next day, with around 2,500 to 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers. The retreat will start the following night. The column is quickly hit with heavy fire. Trucks and tanks will break down, and wounded have to be left behind. The Ukrainian army suffered some 250 plus casualties, possibly even more. Some Ukrainian pockets left behind will hold out until the 20th of February. The front will stabilize, and no major territorial changes will occur, even if fighting will continue. The Ukrainian armed forces, despite having almost everything working against them, and some major tactical flaws in not pulling back in time, still manages to stabilize the front, which at this point must be considered a reasonable outcome for them at the time. They had success against separatists until conventional Russian forces intervened in the fighting. The attack in the Donbass from 2014 onwards was a heavy blow, and they suffered a lot of casualties. The Ukrainian army learned its lessons in a way the Russian army did not, and so it would be much better prepared in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of the country. They identified several problems, both badly coordination for the joint commands and the joint resources. They were having old legislation, and they needed new reforms. The social standard of the military services were also low, and corruption would divert limited resources. Engineers. The downsizing had left that part of the service unable to handle the threats of mining, bridging, fortification, and so on, and that would require improvement. Electronic warfare. Brigades lacking EW units would hinder them from disrupting enemy command and control. They lacked systems for jamming. Also, a problem was that most repairs of this kind of equipment had previously been done in a city close to Donetsk, and that was no longer in Ukrainian hands. Logistics. Problems were identified within the table of organization and its equipment. This meant that combat units lacked logistical support, and they even lacked billeting for personnel behind the front, and those were all identified problems. All of this would delay resupply of military units at the front. Maintenance and repair support. The problem here was that the organization could not handle the volume as the conflict escalated. They also identified problems to collect damaged vehicles for repairs. Up to 50% of equipment required additional maintenance when it was removed from storage. The civilian vehicles drafted were poorly maintained, and 50% were not functioning at all. Other companies whose vehicles were drafted did not provide the vehicles at all, or they provided unsuitable vehicles, or the vehicles were simply abroad doing other jobs. They also had a problem with the training level of the personnel, that it was not adequate. Technical training lacked practical experience. Mobile repair teams had problem diagnosing issues, which made quick actions problematic. The end of the life cycle for systems and the forced use of spare parts in stock, where new parts would be difficult or even impossible to source, was a big problem. Communication and automation of the command and control. The lack of a common information and telecommunication solution and integrated solutions, plus the lack of a cyber defense, were all problems. The equipment they were forced to use were obsolete, so they had to revert to using mobile phones for combat communication, and that was all problems at the start of the conflict. However, here, with the help of volunteers and domestic and international support, many of those issues have been solved. Each platoon now have satellite communication capability. The new communication networks give, if needed, each soldier a means of communication. And they have replaced old analog radios with digital radios. Medical support. A big deficiency was the lack of armored evacuation vehicles. They also identified the lack of a general database for wounded, and the feedback between military and civilian hospitals were not in place. Artillery. Here a problem was the lack of good reconnaissance. They also lacked in training on all levels, especially regarding asymmetric warfare. The counter-battery fire had low effect, and the enemy had longer-ranging artillery pieces. They also identified that they lacked integration of reconnaissance assets together with fire missions. Improvements. Use of firepower and artillery. The carousel included tanks and artillery, alternating firing and then quickly shifting positions to predetermined new locations, proved to be effective. They also decentralized command and control. Another effective way was the use of roaming artillery units for counter-battery fire. Mobility. The use of mobile forces in an active defense, combined with raids and counterattacks, increased the battle area while reducing the number of units needed. They also increased knowledge of counter-ambush, ambush, and search and attack operations. Anti-tank defense. The horseshoe deployment with 2 to 3 kilometer front and also having 2 to 3 kilometers in depth have proven effective. The Ukrainian armed forces faced several severe structural problems up until 2014. The many reforms, and some very well conceived reforms, were never implemented. The fact that they managed to resist Russia and separatist forces in 2014 shows their fighting ability and high morale, rather than they had a sound system to lean on. Some errors occurred during the 2014-15 war in the Donbas region, but they also had some successes. Between 2014 and 2022, they improved their armed forces in some radical ways that created an effective fighting force. They worked on command and control, logistics, improving their hardware within the means of the budget. The biggest improvement by far was the move towards letting junior officers make battlefield decisions, making the force flexible. This alone, I would say, made them punch well above their weight. They are simply a better army than the Russian army we are seeing at present. The problems they now face is not in organization or combat doctrine. The problem is simply modern weapons and ammunition. And this will be a struggle for Ukraine in the short to the long term. They will rely heavily on Western support, something that can be beneficial, but it can also be detrimental. Some weapon systems will come with strings attached. Others will not be delivered in enough numbers, and that will impact both strategic and tactics. A wide variety of different systems will mean an ever more complex logistical situation as the weapons age or need maintenance. In the worst case scenario, this situation can lead to a position where Ukraine is not allowed to lose, but it's not allowed to win either. That means a war dragging on for years with untold military and civilian casualties. This can happen even with substantially more aid, but the chance would diminish compared to the low to moderate aid the country has received so far. The Ukrainian army before 2014 was more an army in name than in actual effectiveness. The Ukrainian army of 2022 is probably one of the best trained and led armies in Europe, and it's an astonishing feat to be done in only 8 years. With an economy struggling, it will be difficult for Ukraine to modernize their weapon systems, and they will struggle to keep the number of active systems in service. What they do have is high morale, very good fighting ability, and good combat awareness. Something that enabled them to force an army 10 times as big as theirs to a virtual standstill.